Welcome to History Nest, where the past whispers you to sleep. When you awaken, you hear the repetitive scratching of stone on stone, echoing through limestone passageways that have been silent for more than 3,000 years. As you stand up, your hands feel the cool sandstone. All of a sudden, you recognize your location, encircled by hieroglyphs that appear to writhe in the flickering light of your torch, deep within a pharaoh's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. In addition to Mir, the air has an earthy, ancient flavor that makes your stomach turn. You see them plainly as your eyes adjust. Archaeologists debated for decades whether or not to take pictures of the etched scenes that covered every surface, showing intimate and strange behaviors. The sterile depictions of Egyptian intimacy you were taught in school are not this. Stories from these walls would make listeners in the present era blush. For more than 2 millennia, an empire was created by tales of holy prostitution, ritual, declaration, and sexual practices that were so entwined with religious devotion. If you love learning about the hidden facts of history, think about clicking the like button and subscribing for more content like this before delving into these lost tales of survival and pain. Additionally, kindly let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. It's amazing to me that we're studying these old tales from around the globe together, bound together by our mutual interest in the past and transcending time and location. Join me as we venture further into that tomb, because what you're about to learn will alter your perspective on one of the most intriguing civilizations in history forever. Unesinamun, being 14 years old, stood shakily in Thiento chamber of Carrick Temple in 1323 BC. The sheerness of her linen dress made it hardly fit the definition of clothing. She shivered, not because she was cold, but because she knew what was coming in. The gold jewelry on her neck, wrists, and ankles clinked quietly. She was set to take part in the Opet festival's divine marriage ceremony, one of ancient Egypt's most revered and unsettling customs. She was the widow of boy King Tutankhamun and the daughter of the heretic Pharaoh Khenaten. High Priest A appeared. Out of the darkness, his eyes filled with a hunger unrelated to spiritual devotion, his shaved head shining with holy oils. It would be expected of Ankhenamun to marry the deity Amun-Ra himself in a matter of moments, or, more accurately, to serve as the god's earthly representative. It wasn't a metaphor. This was not a symbolic act. The most prominent religious leaders in Egypt used divine mandate to seize royal women's bodies, and throughout pharaonic history, it occurred with frightful frequency. Archaeologist Bernard Breyer's 1922 discovery of papyrus documents from Deir el-Medina shows that such religious prostitution was not exclusive to royal women. Hundreds of young girls were employed as gods' wives, euphemistic term for what amounted to ritualized sexual slavery, according to temple documents. Throughout Egypt's liturgical calendar, these girls, some as young as 12, were chosen for their beauty and purity before being consecrated to different gods. The clinical efficiency of the selecting process itself was severe. In order to check for physical flaws that would annoy the gods, temple priests would examine candidates while they were nude. Ironically, a girl would have been spared years of ritualized torture under the pretense of religious devotion if she had been disqualified from temple service due to a minor scar, an irregular tooth, or even asymmetrical breasts. According to Dr. Joyce Tylesley's research at Manchester University, Thieves' temple narratives, from as early as 1550 BC, describe the day-to-day activities of these revered prostitutes. They were prohibited from getting married or having children. Outside of their religious obligations, resided in temple complexes, and wore unique attire that identified their position. When they did get pregnant as a result of their temple service, the offspring were frequently devoted back to the temples, resulting in cycles of religious sexual servitude that continued for generations. However, the frequency of these heavenly pairings was not the most unsettling feature. They were public by nature. Thousands of Egyptians would assemble to watch the king or high priests perform holy marriages with temple women at significant religious festivals. Lecupiter, men said. The people who thought they were witnessing real heavenly activity that would guarantee the flood of the Nile, the bountiful crop, and the prosperity of the kingdom, witnessed these rituals in public, rather than in private rooms. According to contemporary reports, the Greek historian Herodotus, who lived around for 50 BC, was shocked to see such rituals when traveling across Egypt, noting that the women displayed obvious signs of suffering that the Egyptian viewer seemed to understand as religious ecstasy. He wrote of witnessing the most beautiful maidens of noble birth being prepared for couplings with gods who appeared in human form. The Temple of Men at Coptos has carved sculptures that clearly depict these celestial nuptials. According to archaeological evidence, women with their faces turned aside are pictured interacting with the god Min, who is portrayed with an upright. Some academics view this artistic tradition as a sign of the women's embarrassment or hesitancy, with carved musicians, dancers, and offerings encircling these focal figures. What was effectively riches drape was given a festival feel. Examining papyrus fragments from the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, which may include the oldest documented trauma treatments in history, reveals the psychological toll on participants. Treatments for women who would serve the gods and later experienced what contemporary psychology would identify as signs of sexual trauma are described in a number of remedies: appetite loss, difficulty sleeping, unexpected crying, and social disengagement. The most terrifying thing, though, might have been how widely society accepted these behaviors. During the New Kingdom era, 1550 to 1070 BC, marriage contracts frequently contained provisions that released husbands from their marital duties in the event that their wives were called to temple duty, even though used women were believed to be blessed by God. Fathers negotiated bride prices that specifically took into account whether their daughters had previously served in temples. A young aristocratic woman who had died in childbirth in 945 BC was examined by the master and embalmer in Behubra's studio amid a reek of natron salt and decay. If the woman's family had realized what was going to happen in this mud brick building on the Nile, they would have been appalled. However, the mummification process included secrets that Egypt's embalmers guarded more tenaciously than any pharaoh's treasure, so they were unaware and would never be. In 2005, Dr. Zahi Hawas's team performed modern CT scans on female mummies from the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The results of the scans prompted Egyptologists to face one of the most unsettling secrets of ancient Egypt: the systematic sexual abuse of female corpses during mummification. About 23% of the female mummies analyzed had scans that clearly demonstrated post-mortem sexual trauma, which is injury that occurs after death but before the final wrapping procedure. These customs were initially alluded to by the Greek historian Herodotus in his chronicles, which were composed in 440 BC in order to avoid offering them humiliations. He observed that families of attractive ladies or women of great status would wait a few days before transporting them to Thebes. One embalmer was caught abusing a recently deceased woman and was later killed by his fellow workers, not for the violation itself, but for being discovered, he said, in a cryptic manner. Excavations in 1881 revealed fragments of papyrus from Deir el-Bahari that appear to be embalmer training guidelines, including unsettling instructions on how to handle female corpses. The hieratic script literature talked about the necessity of purification rites that included opening the body's sacred channels. At first, contemporary researchers thought they were just routine evisceration techniques, but the precise anatomical, terminology, and ceremonial setting point to something much darker. Corpses were kept in embalmers' workshops for the whole 70-day mummification process, with little supervision from families or religious leaders. Embalmers frequently worked alone during the night shifts, when most Egyptians thought the deceased were most susceptible to spiritual attack. According to workshop records from Tanis, dating back to 1000 BC, because of these nighttime working arrangements, there were ideal conditions for abuse that would go unnoticed and unreported. Ancient writings that attempted to address the issue, as well as contemporary CT scans, provide tangible proof of these transgressions. Legal documents from 156 BC, found in the Harris Papyrus, which is currently housed in the British Museum, describe the prosecution of multi-embalmers for defiling the sacred vessels. Symphomistic legal word that modern historians believe alludes to the sexual exploitation of corpses. The consequences were harsh. The ritualistic nature of these rituals, however, was their most unsettling feature. According to the evidence, some embalmers thought that having sex with the deceased gave the abuser the woman's life power, which resulted in increased virility or a longer lifespan. And amulets discovered in embalming studios sometimes featured sexual actions with mummified figures, portraying necrophilia as a type of magical practice rather than straightforward abuse. When analyzed using contemporary forensic methods, exhibits glaring evidence of post-mortem violation, initially believed to have been ruined by tomb robbers. Her mummy wrappings actually exhibit patterns of intentional unwrapping, wrapping in the pelvic region. The presence of resin residue between the wrapping layers suggests that the body was accessed more than once throughout the mummification process, far more than would be necessary for any valid preservation method. Early Christians were horrified by Egyptian mummification methods. According to contemporary testimonies from Coptic Christian scriptures written centuries later, in a 385 AD letter, Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria expressly denounced the desecration of female corpses by people claiming to be representatives of the gods of death. According to his account, these customs persisted well into the Roman era and gained such notoriety that Christian households completely rejected Egyptian mummification rituals. According to Memphis records, embalmers committed suicide at rates significantly higher than those of other occupations. They frequently drowned in the Nile, a practice that the Egyptians thought prohibited the soul from entering the afterlife. According to some academics, new bodies, fornicrophilic activities, intentional poisoning with oleander is evident in the mummy of a young woman found in the Saklan necropolis. Papyrus fragments containing prayers pleading with Osiris for forgiveness are found in her wrappings. Princess Sidamun listened to her father's footsteps approaching while pressing her forehead against the cool limestone wall of her chamber at Malkarta Palace. She had already given birth to her father, Pharaoh Hotep III, at the age of 23. She also had at least one child, a daughter, who played in the royal grounds without realizing that her grandfather was also her father. Sidamun would carry out her responsibilities as wife and daughter tonight, as she had done so many times before, continuing the cycle of incest that had characterized Egyptian royalty for more than 1,000 years. In ancient Egypt, royal incest was neither an anomaly nor a historical exaggeration. It was methodical, purposeful, and meticulously recorded in official royal documents. Geneticist Dr. Caston pushes 2010 analysis of royal mummy DNA from the Cairo Museum showed that pharaonic family trees were more like biological catastrophes than royal lineages. According to a DNA study, Tutankhamun, who was born into a brother-sister relationship, had several congenital conditions, such as spina bifida, clubfoot, and temporal lobe epilepsy, all most likely the outcome of intergenerational breeding, beginning with the oldest Egyptian dynasties in 3100 BC. The practice peaked in intensity during the 18th dynasty, which lasted from 1550 to 1295 BC. Thutmose I, the pharaoh, wed Armos, his sister. The practice persisted with compulsive regularity after their son, Thutmose, to wed his half-sister Hatshepsut. Using particular legal language, royal marriage contracts from this era, which are preserved on papyrus in the Metropolitan Museum, distinguished between wives who were half-sisters, full sisters, sisters of the house, and sisters of the body. Children from each of these categories were given distinct inheritance rights. However, royal incest was much more widespread than sibling marriage. Akhenaten had sex with at least 6 of his daughters at the same time, according to palace documents. From Amana and Pharaoh Amenhotep II married 3 of his daughters. The pharaoh is shown kissing one daughter, while another sits on his knee in a limestone relief from his capital at Amana. The hieroglyphic inscription identifies the 2 girls as his cherished brides and daughters of his body. Examining royal women's shortened lifespans and frequent unexplained deaths reveals the psychological toll they endured. Akhenaten's daughter and wife, Queen Ankon, who later married Tutanka, lived to be 27 years old. Ancient by royal standards. Vitamin D insufficiency from infrequently leaving palace chambers, stress fractures from physical abuse, and persistent depression based on bone analysis. Detail remedies for ailments that contemporary physicians acknowledge are caused by incest. Instructions for splints, exercises, and herbal remedies for children born twisted imply that royal physicians were treating birth abnormalities on a regular basis. One particularly unsettling sentence, which probably alludes to the genital malformations seen in highly inbred societies, discusses a surgical procedure for infants born with sealed passageways. The royal mummy cache found at Dr. el-Bahari in 1881 provides the most horrifying proof. 9 of the 11 royal mummies discovered there were the result of incestuous unions, and 7 of them had serious genetic problems. According to DNA tests, 2 daughters born from his marriage to his half-sister, Anissa Moon, were 2 of the infant mummies discovered in his tomb. Both had neural tube anomalies that prevented them from surviving. The selection of daughters for royal marriage was a common source of palace intrigue. Several notes from foreign monarchs expressing dismay at Egyptian marriage practices may be found in the Marna letters, which are diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and its neighboring kingdoms. In 1350 BC, your wives are your daughters are your wives. When my scribes draft marriage contracts, this perplexes them. Egyptian royal women frequently tried to avoid their fate in a variety of ways. According to modern archives, daughters were forced back by Egyptian forces after escaping to neighboring countries, according to several papyri accounts. The practice created its own perverted court culture where normal family relationships became impossible. One text from 1345 BC describes Princess Bo-Katan's attempt to seek asylum with the Hittites, writing to their king, "My father wishes to make me his wife, as he did my sisters, but I would rather die in foreign lands than submit to such violation of nature's law." Royal children grew up wondering if their brothers were truly fathers or uncles, and if their moms were truly sisters or aunts. Ramesses II's palace archives detail a convoluted system of titles and manners intended to manage these muddled ties, including particular procedures for dealing with family members who held several positions at once. Identification with the gods, Isis and Osiris, who were siblings married to one another, provided a religious rationale for incest. Royal couples are depicted making offerings in temple reliefs, and hieroglyphic writing highlights their sibling bond as a heavenly gift. Private hepapi from aristocratic families, however, demonstrate a general distaste for royal customs. Around 1330 BC, a nobleman wrote to his son, "In their caves, the royal family breeds like animals, fathers and daughters, sisters and brothers. For this reason, the gods cursed their offspring with premature death and twisted limbs. With every generation, the genetic effects grew worse." By the end of the 18th dynasty, over 60% of royal infants died at birth, and those that survived frequently had physical abnormalities, intellectual problems, and shorter lifespans. According to Tutankhamun's own mummy, he was a young man who required help to walk, experienced chronic discomfort, and passed away at the age of 19 from issues that genetic evidence indicates were directly linked to Hisson-bred ancestry. At Dendr, 12-year-old Nefertari lay on the stone altar with her tiny hands clutching the carved edges, till her knuckles grew white while oil lamps flickered in the temple of Hathor. Priests were performing a ritualized statement to open the sacred gateway for the gods, and she was about to become the latest victim of one of the most cruel religious traditions in ancient Egypt. Dozens of temple officials would see the event. Scribes would document it, and a community that viewed her violation as a divine blessing would celebrate it. Such rites were far from uncommon. According to archaeological evidence from the Temple of Silent at Karuk, over 300 distinct declaration rituals are listed on stone tablets that document temple events from 1400 to 1200 BC. The tablets also include the names of the participating ladies, their ages, and the names of the priests who conducted the ceremonies. 9 years old was the youngest girl ever recorded. The oldest was 16. Most were in the 12 to 14 age range. Barely made it through puberty in a culture that cruelly and prematurely ended childhood. 3 days of complex purification rites preceded the process. Girls who were chosen for declaration were given special meals that were thought to increase their spiritual receptivity, bathed in hallowed waters, and anointed with oils infused with myrrh and frankincense. They were only allowed to talk to approved temple priestesses during this time of preparation, who gave them instructions on their divine responsibilities and cautioned them that showing fear or opposition would enrage the gods. Fragments of papyrus from the Ramesseum explained how these acts were justified theologically according to Egyptian priests. Men who had experienced particular purifying rites were the only ones who could appropriately harvest the unique spiritual power that came with female virginity through ceremonial declaration. The act itself was regarded as a kind of sacrifice, offering the girls suffering and blood to the gods in return for their favor on the community as a whole. The rituals were conducted according to strict guidelines found in temple instruction. Manuscripts found at Edfu. The girl would be presented to the gathered witnesses, wearing gold jewelry and a sheer linen gown, signifying her position as a sacred offering. While temple musicians performed certain hymns intended to call forth fertility gods, incense would be burned. Afterwards, a high priest, who was a representative of the deity, would use tools that had been preserved as holy relics, knives, stone flisses, or intricately carved wooden artifacts that were thought to channel divine power to deflower the girl. Physical proof of these activities was discovered by Dr. Joanne Fletcher through her examination of human remains discovered in temple complexes at Abydos. Young females' skeletal remains exhibit pelvic damage compatible with forceful sexual assault, frequently followed by symptoms of infection and occasionally internal injuries that result in death. These remains are dated by carbon dating, which indicates that the practices persisted for more than 500 years during Egypt's imperial era. Religious teaching either systematically neglected or distorted the psychological effects of these ceremonies. It was believed that girls who displayed symptoms of trauma, muteness, withdrawal, or self-harm were touched by the divine and frequently committed to temple duty for the rest of their lives. Herbal medicines for violent outbursts, insomnia, and unwillingness to eat are among the treatments for divine madness in young women found in mediaeval papyri. Symptoms of severe sexual trauma that are recognized by contemporary psychology, with various priests specializing in various facets of the ceremony. Some temples established complex hierarchies around declaration ceremonies. Administrative records found in Chesterbedi Papyrus v6 demonstrate that some priests were the designator penners of the sacred gateway. This title came with particular benefits, such as nicer accommodation, more food rations, and the ability to choose which females they would. These jobs were in great demand and frequently passed down from father to son, resulting in abusive abuser dynasties. Traveling scribes who chronicled cultural variances between temple complexes noted regional variations in these traditions. To symbolically connect the girl's bleeding to the river's life-giving waters. Declaration ceremonies were usually held in Lower Egypt during the inundation season when the Nile flooded. The rituals, in Apora, Egypt, corresponded with harvest celebrations, and the girl's transgression was interpreted as guaranteeing the fertility of both crops and herds. The most unsettling accounts are from the Temple of Men in Coptos, where mass declaration rites involving dozens of females at once were part of the annual festivals. In a letter from 25 BC, Greek traveler Strauss recounted observing such a festival and expressed his surprise at seeing priests rape maidens who were no older than children. According to his testimony, a number of females passed away during the ceremonies due to shock or blood loss, but their deaths were hailed as symbols of divine acceptance as the throng shouted and flung flowers. Families were frequently paid for sending daughters to these ceremonies. According to economic data, although the payments were set up to avoid rejection, families were granted land grants, animals, or grain, but only after their daughters had finished their sacred service, according to temple ledgers taken from Thebes. Severe consequences, such as property loss, banishment, or forced labor demands, await families that try to remove their daughters before ceremonies. Resistance networks among women who sought to shield young girls from being chosen for these rituals are alluded to in certain extant documents. When temple scouts were looking for new candidates, families were warned using coded language, according to papyrus fragments from private archives. According to scholars, one piece of literature from 1250 BC says, "When the lotus seekers come to your door, remember that the river runs deep, but also runs away." This passage is said to have referred to escape routes taken by families who were trying to avoid having their daughters chosen for declaration rituals at Bubastis. Hundreds of oil lamps were ignited around the complex as twilight descended on the Temple of Bastet. Across walls adorned with hieroglyphics that portrayed cats, dancers, and ritual scenes. Their flickering light created dancing shadows. Ptolemaic Egypt was getting ready for one of its most infamous religious celebrations in 570 BC, a three-day eventhanering, the cat goddess, in which regular women were converted into holy prostitutes and offered their bodies to strangers. Even experienced ancient historians would be shocked by what transpired during these events. However, it was only one part of a system of religious prostitution that had been in place in Egypt for more than 2,000 years. Around 450 BC, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote about his first-hand observations of these celebrations. Every year, the ladies of this area congregate at the temple dedicated to Bastet, where they sell themselves for 3 days to any male who pays the goddess the appropriate amount. During this time, no lady had the right to turn away a male, whether he be Persian, Greek, Egyptian, or Nubian. The act itself is regarded as the most sacred duty a woman can carry out, but the money donated goes to the temple. Physical evidence of these prostitute festivals was found beneath the temple floors during Edward Novel's 1887-1889 archaeological excavations at Bubastis. Thousands of tiny ceramic tokens with explicit sexual imagery on one side and the picture of Bastet on the other were discovered by archaeologists. During religious festivals, these carbon-dated tokens, which range in date from 800 to 200 BC, were used as payment receipts for sexual services. The overwhelming quantity of tokens, more than 12,000, were found at one excavation site indicates that thousands of women performed sexual acts for thousands of males over comparatively brief periods of time during these festivities. In Egypt, however, religious prostitution went far beyond yearly celebrations. A permanent class of sacred prostitutes, known as God's wives of Ammon, were employed year-round to serve male temple visitors. According to temple records found in a file found during the Aswan High Dam rescue operations in the 1960s, these women adhered to stringent religious regulations governing their sexual services, lived in designated areas within temple complexes, and wore unusual attire that promoted their availability. Papyrus archives found at Tetanus in 1899 provide a remarkable amount of data about the everyday life of these sacred prostitutes. Prostitutes' personal correspondence reveals the psychological toll of their circumstances. Around 200 BC, a woman wrote to her sister, "I have served 37 men this month, and still the goddess demands more. My body aches, but worse is my heart, which grows harder each day like Yaystone left in the sun. I pray to Bastet to release me from this service, but she remains silent." According to economic records, sacred prostitution brought in a significant amount of money for Egyptian temples. Account documents at the Temple of Sobek at Crocodiliopolis describe offerings of grain, livestock, and precious metalses, well, as payments for sexual services. Prostitution brought in more money than all other temple sources combined during the busiest festival times. This financial reliance produced strong incentives to increase the number of prostitutes and provide more sexual services, even at the expense of human life. Sacred prostitute recruitment mirrored trends that contemporary observers would identify as human trafficking. Temple officials would visit impoverished families and offer to take their daughters as the goddess maids in exchange for good food, shelter, and spiritual benefits. Girls hardly ever left temple complexes once they were inside. When families tried to reclaim daughters who had been enlisted for temple service, they were informed that the girls had sworn holy vows that could not be violated without divine retribution. According to legal records from Oxyrhynchus, the Kahun Archives Medical Peri include a wealth of knowledge on how to cure illnesses and wounds that are frequent among holy prostitutes. Treatments for pregnancy prevention, plants that induce abortion, and genital injury healing salves are frequently mentioned, as are remedies for temple sickness, which are probably sexually transmitted illnesses. One particularly unsettling piece implies that abuse was widespread and systematic by describing surgical techniques for treating significant interior damage caused by aggressive clients during times of economic difficulty, like famine or war. The age at which females entered sacred prostitution fell dramatically. According to temple statistics, more females as young as 10 or 11 years old are making holy dedications. Numerous females under the age of 14 are listed in the Wilbur Papyrus, which dates to 141 BC, as sacred prostitutes at different temples. Several of these girls are described as having not yet attained womanhood, but already serving male patrons. Greek and Roman visitors who traveled throughout Egypt recorded regional differences in religious prostitution practices. In Memphis, sex workers catered to customers in subterranean rooms beneath the main temple complex. These rooms included sophisticated ventilation systems, and soundproofing, which may indicate that the activities were purposefully concealed from the public. At Elephantine, prostitution occurred in the grounds that surrounded the temple, where clients and prostitutes performed sexual activities while other guests offered prayers in the vicinity. Religious brainwashing, which started in childhood, served to further the psychological control over sacred prostitutes. Girls were taught that their bodies were conduits for heavenly energy, that serving strangers sexually was the ultimate form of worship, and that resistance or discontent was a sign of spiritual failure. Various temple sites have confession writings that depict prostitutes writing prayers and pleading for forgiveness for sentiments of disgust, fear, or a desire to avoid their responsibilities. Some sex workers made an effort to record their experiences in ways that have stood the test of time. Messages from women working as holy prostitutes are inscribed into the temple walls at Ifu. Many people are expressing resignation or desperation. According to one inscription from 156 BC, Isis knows the pain in my heart, but I cannot speak it aloud. May other daughters be spared this blessing. Another merely says, I have forgotten my name, but the goddess remembers my body, sacred. Prostitution created intricate legal and social issues that Egyptian courts found difficult to resolve. Thieves' court documents detailed instances in which individuals demanded payment from temples after acquiring STDs from sacred prostitutes, paternity, inheritance rights, and whether the children of sacred prostitution belonged to their mothers, or the temples where they were conceived, were among the issues covered in other court documents. As User Hatmus prepared the mummy of a noblewoman named Merit Pate for her eternal trip in 1279 BC, Theme Balmer's workshop next to the Valley of the Kings hummed with activity. However, this treatment was much more than just preserving the flesh and removing the organs. Merit Pate would require her sexual organs to remain undamaged and functional for the afterlife, when she would be expected to perform sexual male ghosts, gods, and maybe the pharaoh himself for eternity. According to religious writings etched deep under royal tombs, therefore, special steps were taken during the mummification process to guarantee that female corpses would continue to be sexually viable for their ostentatious functions. Sexual practices envisaged in the afterlife are explicitly described in the pyramid texts, which date to 2400 BC and are among Egypt's oldest religious writings. While female spirits are said to exist primarily to give male souls sexual pleasure, dead pharaohs are promised lovely women who will serve them in every way. According to Pyramid Text 690, the king will possess the wives of the gods, and they will satisfy his desires as they satisfied the desires of their divine husbands when they lived. Archaeological evidence from tombs in the Valley of the Queens shows that royal and noble women were interred with items made especially for sexual use in the afterlife. A group of phallocardics composed of stone, ivory, and wood were discovered during Dr. Joanne Fletcher's excavations at QV5, which is thought to be the tomb of one of Rames II's daughters. These items were wrapped in linen and positioned between the mummy's legs so that the spirit of the departed woman could still access them. Similar items have been discovered in dozens of New Kingdom female burials in order to preserve sexual capability for the afterlife. The mummification process for women involved steps not taken on male corpses in order to suppress tissue collapse during preservation. Papyrus papers from the workshops at Thebes describe inserting linen soaked in resin into the vaginal tubes of female bodies. But rather than merely preserving sexual organs, the materials and placement of these insertions indicate that they were intended to retain their accessibility and form. The tomb murals found in the tombs of high-ranking officials show the deceased having sex with female attendants who perished alongside them, while other figures prepare food and provide entertainment. Wall murals at the tomb of Vizierum Teti, 10,100, which dates to 1450 BC, depict the deceased official copulating with ladies, who are identified as his eternal servants. These pictures weren't symbolic or ornamental. They served as manuals for tasks that were supposed to be carried out in the hereafter during Egypt's early dynasty period. The custom of offering female servants as sacrifices to follow male tomb owners into death was widely documented. However, it persisted in varying forms throughout pharaonic history. Evidence of ritual strangulation, poisoning, or live burial of young women can be found in skeletal remains from subsidiary tombs located next to major burial sites. The remains of 338 sacrificed servants were found in the tomb of Pharaoh Dia at Abydos, which dates to 3000 BC, according to forensic investigation. 127 of these were young ladies who did not exhibit any symptoms of natural death. The perpetual sexual obligations that women are required to do in the hereafter are described in religious scriptures discovered in private tombs. In the negative confession part of the Book of the Dead, chapter 125, spirits are required to confess a variety of misdeeds to the gods. For women, this confession entails vows to open oneself to those who have gained heavenly favor and to fulfill the wishes of good men. These passages make it abundantly evident that sexual service was demanded of female souls as a punishment for their innately evil nature, rather than as a reward for their own purity. Evidence of post-mortem sexual posture intended to promote necrophilic practices has been found in female mummies examined by forensic experts. There are indications that Queen Hanatui's mummy, who was the wife of High Priest Penjamai, had her legs held open and moved during the wrapping procedure. Dozens of female mummies from the 21st dynasty exhibit similar positions, indicating that female corpses were systematically prepared for sexual access, one of the most unsettling instances of afterlife. Sexual expectations can be found in the tomb of Pharaoh Seti, only found in 1960. The hidden chambers beyond the main burial hall feature explicit wall murals depicting the deceased pharaoh having sex with female deities, goddesses, and mortal women. According to the hieroglyphic writings that go with these pictures, the women are perpetual concubines who will fulfill the king's wishes for all of eternity without complaining or taking a break. Royal and noble tombs frequently contain burial items made especially for sexual activity in the afterlife. A group of items discovered in the tomb of Queen Tai's parents, Yuya and Tuyu, were first classified by archaeologists as religious instruments, but are now known to be advanced sex toys. These items, which were wrapped in the finest linen and placed in cedar boxes with prayers for their efficacy in the hereafter, were remarkably anatomically accurate carvings of ebony and ivory. spells, and techniques for maintaining mummified. Women's sexual appeal to male spirits are found in mediaeval papyrus, because ugliness repels the desires of both men and gods, even in death. The Edwin Smith surgical papyrus contains instructions on how to prevent facial disfigurement during mummification, specifically for female corpses, because these processes were more costly and time-consuming than traditional mummification. Embalmers were able to make a living by catering to affluent families who wanted to make sure their daughters would still be appealing in the afterlife. Greek and Roman tourists at the time reported being appalled at the way ladies were buried in Egypt. In his article from 50 BC, Diodorus Siculus expressed his surprise at seeing that Egyptian women are prepared for death in the same way as they are for marriage, with special attention paid to their sexual organs and their capacity to satisfy men after death. He related seeing deceased women clothed and positioned like courtesans waiting for customers during burial preparations. Personal letters and parts of diaries that have survived attest to the psychological effects of knowing one's eternal fate on Egyptian women who are still alive. Around 1200 BC, a woman wrote to her sister, "The eternal servitude that awaits me is what makes me fear death, not the agony of passing away. I can choose my husband in life, but I have to serve whoever the spirit wants me to be in death." In a different letter, discovered in a Saqqara tomb, a woman begs the gods to let her pass away before her beauty deteriorates, in the hopes that being ugly will protect her from sexual demands in the afterlife. According to contemporary Greek and Roman visitors, Egyptian burial customs involving women horrified them. In his article from 50 BC, Diodorus Siculus expressed his surprise at seeing that Egyptian women are prepared for death in the same way as they are for marriage, with special attention paid to their sexual organs and their capacity to satisfy men after death. He related seeing deceased women clothed and positioned like courtesans waiting for customers during burial preparations. During the most aborted festivals, thousands of people gathered to witness behaviors that would have been illegal in the open, but were made sacrosanct under the guise of religious ceremony, and sacred lakes next to temples reflected Dorklet. In scenes of ritualized sexual violence, seized foreign slaves, temple prostitutes, and aristocratic ladies mixed together in the hopes of gaining divine favor. These interactions resulted in children who were reared as temple property, perpetuating centuries-long cycles of cruelty. The most unsettling aspect, though, was perhaps how thoroughly Egyptian culture accepted these behaviors. It was common for marriage contracts to have provisions that released husbands from responsibility in the event that wives were called to sexual service for God. Fathers used the daughter's prior temple service to determine the wedding price. Instead of treating ritual rape trauma as therapeutic, medical books viewed it as holy craziness that needed to be gratefully acknowledged. One of Octavian's first actions after Rome's eventual conquest of Egypt in 30 BC was to outlaw ritual, declaration rites, and temple prostitution. Centuries later, Christian missionaries discovered deserted temples with graphic carvings on their walls that the local Egyptians had become too embarrassed to show their offspring. Now return via those tomb passageways, past hieroglyphs whose meanings were still being deciphered. Every symbol narrates the tale of a society that recognized both cruelty and beauty, saw divinity in depravity, and believed that the innocent people's suffering was the cost of the gods' favor. Humanity's ability to sanctify the unimaginable is demonstrated by the private customs of ancient Egypt, a reminder that the mask of the sacred has frequently been worn by the most heinous deeds throughout history. Re-enter the light, but keep in mind what can be hiding there. Recall the warnings that have been echoed for millennia through limestone tunnels. Keep in mind that every griot civilization has secrets that have been kept in stone for all time and written in blood and tears. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe to History Nest, where every night a new story takes flight.